May 22, 1942. The battleship Yamato at anchor in the inland sea of Japan, 220 nautical miles southwest of Hiroshima. Commander Yasuji Watanabe of Admiral Yamamoto's combined fleet staff laid a single typed page on the chart table in the flag plot and slid it across the polished surface toward the four other officers gathered around the map. The page contained the latest American carrier disposition estimate, prepared by Naval Intelligence in Tokyo, refined by signals intercepts from the radio station at Owada, and stamped with the red operational seal that meant it could be used as the basis for battle planning. The page listed 3 American fleet carriers in the Pacific: Enterprise, currently operating in the South Pacific; Hornet, currently operating in the South Pacific; Yorktown, struck by an 800-kilogram bomb during the action in the Coral Sea on the 8th of May, returning to Pearl Harbor for repairs estimated at a minimum of 90 days in dry dock. The officers around the table read it. Nobody argued with it. The 800-kilogram bomb from the Shokaku Air Group had been observed to penetrate Yorktown's flight deck near the forward elevator and detonate 4 decks below in the third deck living spaces. Photographs from the strike force showed the carrier listing, smoke streaming aft, her flight operations suspended. Japanese damage control doctrine, developed over 20 years of fleet exercises, had a number for that kind of hit: 3 months minimum, often longer. So when Commander Watanabe drew the arrow on the chart that represented the projected American defense of Midway, atoll 5.5 weeks later, he drew it against 2 carriers, not 3. The math worked. The 4 fleet carriers of Vice Admiral Nagumo Chuichi's striking force against 2 American carriers caught isolated in the Central Pacific. A 3-day operation, a trap closed by overwhelming superiority. The plan had been signed off by Admiral Yamamoto personally. What Commander Watanabe did not know, what nobody in the combined fleet staff that afternoon could have known, was that 1,200 miles southeast of Pearl Harbor, the USS Yorktown was at that moment steaming home at 20 knots with one of her boiler rooms still flooded and her hangar deck still scorched black. And that waiting for her on the dock at the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard was an admiral who had already done something a Japanese staff officer could not imagine doing. He had read the damage report. He had asked his yard superintendent for a repair estimate, and when the yard had given him the number 90 days, he had handed it back and said 3. This is the story of those 3 days. It is the story of 1,400 American shipyard workers who turned a wrecked aircraft carrier into a combat asset in a window of time that the Japanese damage doctrine said was physically impossible. It is the story of why on the morning of June 4th, 1942, the Japanese striking force came over the horizon expecting 2 American carriers and found 3. And it is the story of how that one extra flight deck, a flight deck the Japanese had crossed off their planning charts 17 days earlier, turned the Central Pacific upside down in 6 minutes. The verdict on Midway is not that the Americans got lucky. The verdict is that the Americans had a system the Japanese could not see and could not match. And the proof of that system was a ship the Japanese had already buried. Part 1. The Japanese number. You have to understand what a Japanese naval officer in 1942 meant when he said 3 months. He was not making a wild guess. He was reading a number out of a doctrine that was as carefully constructed as any document in the Imperial Japanese Navy. The IJN had spent the entire 1930s building itself around what they called the Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. Every ship, every gun, every torpedo, every doctrine of repair and replacement had been organized around a single concept. The Japanese fleet would meet the American fleet once, in one engagement, probably in the Western Pacific, and whatever damage was inflicted in that battle would be repaired afterward at leisure in home waters. Damage control during the battle was about staying afloat long enough to keep firing. Damage repair was something you did at Kure or Yokosuka or Sasebo after the smoke cleared. This produced a repair philosophy that on paper made enormous sense. Repairs were thorough. Repairs were complete. A Japanese carrier with a penetrated flight deck did not return to combat with a wooden patch and a prayer. She returned to combat with a new flight deck, properly steel-plated, fully painted, with all welds inspected. The standard for restoring a damaged capital ship was that she had to be as combat-worthy as the day she was launched. That standard meant time. The Shokaku herself, the carrier whose air group had bombed the Yorktown at Coral Sea, had also been damaged in that same battle by 3 American bomb hits. The Shokaku was at that very moment in Kure Naval Base. Her repair estimate was 90 days. The IJN had no doctrinal mechanism for asking whether she could be patched and sent back to sea in 72 hours. The question would not have occurred to a Japanese yard superintendent because the question violated every assumption in the system. There was a second reason for the long repair window, and this one was structural. The Japanese repair yards had been built on a peacetime industrial model: limited dry docks, limited welding crews, limited supplies of armor plate and structural steel for hasty patching. The Japanese economy in 1942 was producing roughly 7 million tons of steel a year. The American economy was producing 86 million tons. The Japanese yard worker doing the math on a damaged carrier had to ask himself whether his materials would last through the repair. The American yard worker did not have to ask that question, because behind him stretched a continent of factories that would deliver whatever he needed in whatever quantity he needed before he was finished using the materials in his hand. And there was a third reason, the deepest of the three. Japanese damage doctrine assumed that the ship was the asset. The American doctrine that was about to be applied to the Yorktown assumed that the ship was a delivery vehicle. The asset was the air group. The asset was the flight deck. The asset was the 80 trained Navy aviators with 2 years of fleet experience who could put a bomb on a Japanese carrier from 12,000 feet. If the ship could float and recover aircraft for 6 days, the ship had served its purpose. Cosmetic repairs, full steel plating, inspected welds. None of those mattered if the aircraft were the weapon and the ship just had to be there. A Japanese naval officer reading a damage report saw a wounded warship. An American naval officer reading the same damage report saw a runway that needed to be operational on Wednesday. This is the gap. This is the gap that opens the rest of the story. Part 2. The 72 Hours. The Yorktown made the channel at Pearl Harbor at 14:30 hours local time on the 27th of May 1942. Captain Elliot Buckmaster was on the bridge. Below him, in the bowels of the ship, the chief engineer was nursing a damaged boiler and 3 flooded compartments. The fires from Coral Sea had been put out 3 weeks earlier. The scorch marks had not. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, was standing on the dock at Dry Dock Number 1 in rubber waders. He had walked through the dock the previous afternoon to inspect the dewatering apparatus personally. He had been pacing. The radio intelligence section at Pearl Harbor, Station Hypo under Commander Joseph Rochefort, had been reading enough of the Japanese Fleet Code, JN-25, to know with reasonable confidence that the next major Japanese operation was aimed at Midway and was scheduled for the first week of June. Nimitz had 10 days, he had Enterprise, he had Hornet, he needed a third flight deck. The Yorktown went into dry dock number 1 that evening. The dock was pumped down through the night. By dawn on the 28th of May, the carrier was sitting dry on the keel blocks, and roughly 400 yard workers from the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard were already at work on her. Read the next sentence carefully, because it is the heart of this story. The yard superintendent at Pearl Harbor had given Nimitz an estimate of 90 days to restore the Yorktown to full combat readiness. Nimitz had told him the ship was sailing in 72 hours. The superintendent had pointed out accurately that the Yorktown's internal structure had been deformed by the bomb hit, that several main frames in the third deck area were buckled, that the hangar deck supports had been compromised, that the proper repair required cutting out and replacing roughly 40 tons of structural steel. Nimitz, according to the recollections of yard personnel preserved in the histories of the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, said something that has been quoted in various forms but always carried the same meaning. He said the ship did not need to be perfect. The ship needed to fight one battle. After the battle, she could be perfect for as long as he liked. What happened over the next 72 hours was not a repair in the sense any Japanese yard officer would have recognized. It was a triage operation conducted at industrial scale. The Fort 400 yard workers were organized into shifts that overlapped at every watch change so that no welding rod was ever idle and no piece of equipment ever cooled. Civilian workers from the city of Honolulu were brought into the yard. Power generation on the island of Oahu was rerouted because the dry dock was drawing so much electrical current that the civilian grid could not sustain both at full load. The lights in Pearl City flickered on the night of the 28th of May because the welders working on Yorktown's hangar deck were running every arc welder the shipyard owned. The repairs themselves were what the Navy called functional, which is a polite word for whatever holds. Buckled frames were not replaced. They were reinforced from below by welded steel plates jacked into position by hydraulic rams. Cracked deck supports were sistered with additional beams rather than cut out and rebuilt. Holes in the hangar deck were covered with welded steel patches rather than full plate replacement. The boiler that had been flooded at Coral Sea was drained, inspected, dried, refired, and tested in roughly 18 hours. The protocol for that kind of boiler restoration in any peacetime context would have taken a week. The yard officers later said that the work being done on Yorktown that week violated dozens of separate naval engineering standards. They also said that every single one of those violations had been signed off by either the yard commander or Admiral Nimitz personally, because the alternative was a Japanese victory at Midway. The work continued without pause through the 28th, through the 29th, and through the 30th. On the morning of the 30th of May 1942, roughly 70 hours after entering the dry dock, Yorktown's whistle blew. The flooding gates on dry dock number 1 were opened. Water rose around her hull. By midday, she was afloat. By the afternoon, she was steaming out of Pearl Harbor Channel under her own power, with her air group flying out to land on her flight deck from Naval Air Station Ford Island. Captain Buckmaster was on the bridge again. The yard workers who had spent 3 days inside her hull were watching her go from the dock, and many of them, according to the accounts collected by the Pearl Harbor Shipyard historians, were crying. She was not repaired, she was patched. She would not have passed any peacetime inspection. She had structural deformations that would have grounded her in any other navy in the world. But she was at sea. She had a flight deck, she had an air group, and she was steaming northwest toward a point called Point Luck, 325 miles northeast of Midway Atoll, where Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher was waiting for her with Task Force 17, and where, 200 miles further northwest, Vice Admiral Nagumo's four-carrier striking force was steaming east into a trap whose dimensions he had calculated using the wrong number of American carriers. The men who patched the Yorktown in 72 hours are not in any textbook. There is no monument to the welder from Honolulu who did not sleep for 3 days. There is no plaque to the yard machinist, whose name is not recorded anywhere except possibly on a paycheck stub in some forgotten Bureau of Yards and Docks file. If this story matters to you, hit the like button. It keeps the men who held the Yorktown together with hot steel and arc rods visible to people who might not otherwise know they existed. Part 3, Midway. On the morning of the 4th of June 1942, the Japanese striking force under Vice Admiral Nagumo was operating on a chart that contained 2 American carriers. The chart was wrong by one. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, 4 fleet carriers, the most experienced naval aviation force in the world at that moment, every one of them a veteran of Pearl Harbor, were launching the first wave of their dawn strike against Midway Atoll at 0430 hours. At that same moment, 230 miles to the northeast of Nagumo's flagship, the USS Yorktown was launching her dawn search planes. 10 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Scouting Squadron 5 were lifting off her flight deck on a search pattern designed to find the Japanese force. The Yorktown was, by every Japanese intelligence estimate, in dry dock at Pearl Harbor. She was not. She was at Point Luck, she was operational, and her air group was about to participate in the most consequential 6 minutes in naval history. What happened over the next 8 hours has been written about in more books than any other action in the Pacific War. The short version is this. American search aircraft from Midway and from the carriers located the Japanese striking force during the morning. American torpedo bomber squadrons from Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown attacked in succession through the late morning. Most of those torpedo bombers were shot down without scoring a single hit. 41 TBD Devastators went into the attack. 35 did not come back. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, 15 aircraft under Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, was destroyed almost to the last man. Ensign George Gay was the only pilot who survived the day. But the torpedo attacks pulled the Japanese combat air patrol down to the wave tops. And while the Zeros were low, the SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived overhead, unopposed at 14,000 feet. At 10:22 hours local time, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's air group from Enterprise pushed over into their dive against Kaga and Akagi. At nearly the same minute, Lieutenant Maxwell Leslie's bombing Squadron 3 from Yorktown, the carrier that was not supposed to be there, pushed over into their dive against Soryu. 6 minutes later, 3 of the 4 Japanese fleet carriers were on fire. Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu would all be lost. The 4th, Hiryu, would launch a counterstrike that found and crippled Yorktown later that afternoon, and Hiryu herself would be sunk by Enterprise's air group before sundown. Read those facts back through the lens of the question that started this audit. If Nagumo had been right, if the Yorktown had been in dry dock at Pearl Harbor on the morning of June 4th, Maxwell Leslie's squadron does not push. Over on Soryu at 10:25 hours. Soryu survives the first strike. The American attack is 2 carriers against 4 instead of 3 against 4. The Japanese counterstrike has more aircraft, more carriers from which to launch, and a clean targeting picture. The arithmetic of Midway runs the other way. The 3rd flight deck was not just an extra ship. The 3rd flight deck was the difference between a one-sided American victory and a one-sided Japanese victory. And the 3rd flight deck was at Midway, only because 400 men in Pearl Harbor had been told by an admiral in rubber waders that 90 days was not an acceptable answer. The Yorktown herself paid for being there. Just after noon on the 4th of June, Hiryu's first strike, 18 Aichi D-3A dive bombers under Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, found her. 3 bombs hit. Fires broke out. She lost speed. The damage control parties got her moving again within 2 hours, which itself was an astonishment to the Japanese pilots, who returned to Hiryu and reported the American carrier sinking. Hiryu launched a second strike. The second strike, 10 Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers under Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, found a carrier underway, assumed it was a second American carrier, and put 2 torpedoes into Yorktown's port side. She listed. The order was given to abandon ship. She did not sink immediately. She floated for 2 more days, dead in the water, attended by the destroyer USS Hammond. On the afternoon of June 6th, the Japanese submarine I-168 under Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe found her. Tanabe fired 4 torpedoes. One missed. 2 hit the Yorktown. One hit the Hammond, which broke in half and sank in 4 minutes with heavy loss of life. The Yorktown rolled over and sank at dawn on June 7th. She had been at sea for about a week, from the moment she sortied from Pearl Harbor on the 30th of May. 3 days of patched welding had bought her that week. In those days, her air group had helped sink one Japanese fleet carrier outright and had contributed to the fatal damage of the entire Japanese carrier striking force. The exchange was, by any rational accounting, the most lopsided trade in the history of carrier warfare. One patched American carrier for the 4 irreplaceable veteran flight decks of the Kido Butai. And here is the part the Japanese never quite understood, the part that the war memoirs of Mitsuo Fuchida and Minoru Genda circle around without ever quite naming. The American shipyard system had done something the Japanese shipyard system could not conceive of doing. It had treated a capital ship as a consumable. It had decided that the ship was less valuable than the air group, that the air group was less valuable than the timing, and that the timing was the entire game. The 400 men in Pearl Harbor had built a temporary carrier out of a permanent one because winning the Battle of Midway was worth the cost of doing it. If your father or grandfather worked at the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard during the war, or served aboard Yorktown, Enterprise, Hornet, or any of the destroyers and cruisers of Task Force 17 or 16, I would be honored to read their names in the comments. Most of the men who fought Midway are gone. The men who built the carriers that fought Midway have been gone even longer. The stories belong in the record where they can be found. Part 4. The Verdict. Here is the answer to the question Commander Watanabe of Yamamoto's staff did not ask on the afternoon of the 22nd of May 1902 when he laid the American carrier disposition estimate on the chart table aboard the battleship Yamato. He did not ask whether the American repair estimate was based on the same assumptions as the Japanese repair estimate. He should have asked, because the assumptions were not the same. They had never been the same, and the gap between them is the gap that decided the Pacific War. The Japanese damage doctrine was built on the premise of an industrial economy that could not afford to lose a capital ship. The repair was thorough because the replacement was years away. A shokaku in dry dock for 90 days was a shokaku that would still be in the fleet in 1944. The system was internally consistent. It was also catastrophically slow. The American damage doctrine was built on the premise of an industrial economy that could replace a capital ship faster than the enemy could sink one. Essex-class fleet carriers were already on the building ways at Newport News, at Norfolk, at New York Naval Shipyard, at Bethlehem Steel and Quincy. 24 of them were under construction or under contract by the end of 1942. The Yorktown did not have to be repaired forever. The Yorktown had to be repaired for one battle. After that battle, there would be more carriers. There would always be more carriers. The American yard workers patching her hangar deck in 72 hours did not have to ask whether the patch would last. They had to ask whether the patch would last until Wednesday. That is the entire forensic verdict on Midway. It is not a verdict about pilots. Though Wade McCluskey and Maxwell Leslie and Richard Best did things in the air above Nagumo's force that the United States Navy will be teaching to flight cadets 100 years from now. It is not a verdict about codebreakers. Though Joseph Rochefort and the men of Station Hypo read enough Japanese radio traffic to put Nimitz's carriers in the right ocean at the right hour. It is not a verdict about luck, though the timing of the dive bomber attacks on the morning of June 4th was the kind of timing a screenwriter would have been embarrassed to put in a script. The verdict is about a system that decided in the spring of 1942 that a wounded carrier could be welded back together in 72 hours because the air group on that carrier was the asset and the carrier was the delivery vehicle, and the delivery vehicle could be made adequate even if it could not be made perfect. The Japanese system, the most disciplined naval system in the world, the system that had built the most experienced carrier striking force in history, could not see this. It could not see it because it had been built around a different assumption about what a ship was for. And so on the morning of the 4th of June, most of them are not about admirals and not about generals. They are about ordinary Americans who looked at a problem the enemy considered impossible and decided that the answer was that the enemy was wrong. The men who patched the Yorktown did not fight at Midway, but they were the reason Midway was won. They deserve to be remembered by name and by trade, and by the fact that without them, the 4 greatest carriers in the Imperial Japanese Navy would have come home from Midway and the war would have lasted 4 more years.